Sashing is not coming in your kit, so you're going to get to pick whatever color you want. And I did take some pictures as I was choosing mine, and I will put those in the video, and I will also show them in class, so you can see what some other colorways would look like. I'm using green, and then I'm going to use cheddar as my cornerstones. We're going to cut 31 3 by 13.5 inch strips, and rather than cutting on the crosswise grain to get my 3-inch strips, I'm going to cut on the lengthwise. And the reason I'm doing that is lengthwise grain is more stable, so it will help to keep my quilt square better, so it won't stretch out of shape. To do that, I actually have this folded with my selvages matching, and I folded it into thirds so you can see it on the camera. And I'm going to start by cutting my selvage off. And it doesn't matter whether you cut this as far as yardage goes on the lengthwise or the crosswise grain, because the pattern calls for 1.25 yards. That makes your piece of fabric almost square. So I'm going to need 31. I'm going to be able to get 3 from the length. 3 13.5 inch strips. So I'm going to need 10 3-inch strips when I'm cutting this. So I'm just going to start in. Actually, since I just did the straight cut on this, I can cut my 6-inch. I probably won't keep cutting 6-inch strips because it's harder to line up the edge of the ruler with the fabric than it is to line up a line. But for this first one I can. And because I have this folded, it still is folded with selvages together, I'm cutting 2 strips at a time here. So I clean cut my one edge, and then I'm going to line up my 3-inch line with my clean cut edge. And cut. So with my first 2 strips, I actually have 4 strips. I'm just going to keep cutting them until I have 10, so I'll just cut one more on camera. My 3-inch line lined up with my clean cut edge, and cut. And even though I changed this blade not that long ago, it's getting to where it needs to be changed again. So that was 2 more, so that's 6, and I will just do 4 more strips. Okay, I cut my 10 strips, and now I need to cut them down into 13.5 inch long pieces. So I still have 2 strips stacked on top of each other, and now they're just folded in half. So I'm cutting 4 layers at once right now. You don't have to do this. You could open it up and cut them one at a time if you want to. So I'm lining up my long edges, and I'm going to clean cut one edge, and then I'm going to line up my 13.5 inch mark with that end, with the end I just clean cut, and I'm going to cut that. So that actually gave me 4 of my 31 strips. And then for the last 2 that I'm going to get out of these 2 strips, I'm going to open this up. So now I only have 2 layers. And I'm going to line up my 13.5 inch mark down on the short end. Any lines on my long edges, and cut. So out of those 2 strips, I got 6. And I'm just going to keep repeating that process until I have my 31 3 by 13.5 inch strips. Okay, I said you were going to need 10 3-inch strips. That's partially accurate. You're going to need 10 complete 3-inch strips, and then you're going to need 1 more partial, because you're going to need 1 more 3 by 13.5 inch piece, because I like to keep my leftover fabric in as big a pieces as possible. I'm just going to cut that last one out of my chunk of fabric. And because I've been moving it around a little bit, I oversized it just a little bit. So I'm going to line up my 3-inch line on the side that I just cut, and my 13.5-inch line on the short edge that I just cut, and trim, and that gives me my 31st 3 by 13.5-inch strip. For my cornerstones, I am using cheddar, and for our cornerstone fabric, whatever one you choose, you need 20 3-inch squares. So now it doesn't, they're going to be squares, so it doesn't matter whether you cut lengthwise or crosswise. So I clean cut my one edge, and I'm going to need 2 strips to get those 20 3-inch squares. Ooh. So you actually are going to want to buy more than 1/6 of a yard. I'll get what I can out of this, but I'm going to have to go back probably and get some more fabric. Pattern called for 1/6. I'm going to recommend that you buy 1/4 of a yard for your cornerstones, because 1/6 you do not have any room for cleaning up your edges. So from the one, or the, you should have, if you buy 1/4 of a yard, 2 3-inch strips. Going to clean cut one edge, and then you can do multiples of 3. So 18, now this mat's not big enough for 18, so I'm going to start with 15. I have 15 inches on the end that I just clean cut. I'm going to cut, and then I'm going to move back in 3-inch increments. So I'm going to go back to 12 inches, and then I'm going to go back to 9 inches, and then I'm going to go back to 6 inches, and then 3. And then I'm just going to keep cutting 3-inch squares off of these strips until I have my 20. Okay, I'm shooting when it's dark outside, so my colors are starting to get funky, but I think you can still see what I want to show you. I've laid the whole quilt out with my sashing cornerstones and block pieces. So what I'm going to do next is sew this together in rows. So the rows that have blocks in them will get a sashing piece between each block and on each end of the row. And then my narrower rows are the cornerstones. So it's a cornerstone sashing, cornerstone sashing, cornerstone sashing, cornerstone. So those together in rows as well. My rows are all sewn together. On the ones with the cornerstones, I pressed toward the cornerstones. On the ones with the blocks, I pressed toward the sashing strips. The next thing to do now is just to sew the rows together to finish the quilt top. My rows are all sewn together, and I press toward the sashing. If you choose not to do the applique, then this completes your quilt top. If you want to add the letters to your quilt, you're going to need to make applique letters. The pattern doesn't give any directions other than it just gives us a font, an alphabet. I'm going to do mine with raw edged fusible, and I'm going to use cotton fabric. I think that when the designer did this, they made their letters out of felt, but it doesn't say in the pattern. So first thing you're going to need, if you're going to do it the way I'm doing it, is a paper-backed fusible web, and you can choose whatever kind you like. There are several different brands out there. I'm trying a new one on this project just to see how it works. You're going to need to trace your alphabet onto the paper side of the fusible web. If you are using Steam-A-Seam, then you're going to want to trace it onto the grid side, a Steam-A-Seam 2. Other than that, I'm not going to talk about Steam-A-Seam. You can read the directions if that's the one you want to use. So we're going to trace it a mirror image. You need to make sure it's a mirror image because this is the back side of my letters. So to do that, I flipped my pattern over on a light box. You could use a window, you could use plexiglass, extension table for your sewing machine with a fluorescent light under it. You can even use your oven door with the light turned on inside. Just something so that you're getting the light shining through from the back. And then I traced all of mine. I used a mechanical pencil. If it bothers you to get a little bit of lead smeared on your hands, then try using a fine tip Sharpie. Once everything is traced, then you're going to follow the directions on your fusible and press it to the wrong side of your fabric. Now I'm using a solid, so it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to take it to the ironing board, and I bought a ½ yard of fabric. It looks like a third would do it easily. But I'm going to take it to the ironing board, and I'm going to press all of this onto the wrong side of my fabric. Okay, I have fused my tracings to the back of the fabric, and now I just need a good sharp pair of scissors, and I'm going to cut all these letters out on the line. Put on a good TV show or a good movie, or a book on tape, and just start cutting. Probably not something that you get real excited about like a sport, but just sit down and relax and cut all these out. Once you have cut all your letters out, it's now time to position them on your quilt. Now that you have the picture of the finished pattern, you can look at the cover picture to see where the designer put the letters, or you can just position them yourself. If you have a corner you don't like or something, this might be a good way to hide it. It's logical to put them near the block that they are representing, but you don't have to. It's your quilt. You can put them wherever you want. So to apply them, we're going to peel the paper off the back side of our letters. And if you have a hard time, and I'm getting this one, I'm just going to peel it off. And then the sticky side gets fused to the fabric, and you're going to need to follow the directions that the manufacturer provides again. But if you have a hard time getting it off, then you can just score the paper with a pen, and I don't have one here at the moment. And where you score it, it will peel away easier to get it started. So again, just arrange them where you want them and fuse them down following the directions on the fusible that you're using. This is just a short tutorial on doing the blanket stitch for stitching down your letters. Obviously, I'm not using the fabric from the quilt. I like to use a heavier thread when I'm doing the blanket stitch so that it shows. You don't have to do that. I'm using a 30 weight right now. I also like an open toe foot so that I can see where I'm going. If you have a needle down function on your machine, use that, because that way you stop and stay where you want to be. As far as the blanket stitch goes, they vary from machine to machine. Some of them will do one straight stitch, then go over and back, and then one straight stitch. Some will do 2 straight stitches, over and back, 2 straight stitches. So you need to check yours. I would also recommend that you test sew, because you can adjust your length and width to be appropriate for whatever you're doing the blanket stitch on. You do want to know which way it's going to swing. If you have a mirror image on your machine, you can change it back and forth depending on how you want to go around your letters. So the first thing I do is I bring my bobbin thread to the top of the fabric just so that it doesn't make a mess underneath. I want to know where it is. And then I do have a tie-off function on mine. You could always just pull the threads to the back after and tie them in back. An embroidery or top stitching needle is not a bad idea because it has a bigger eye for the heavier weight thread. If you have an inconspicuous spot on your applique where you can start and stop, that's good. With this eye, there's really no inconspicuous spot. My straight stitch, when I'm taking it, is going right along the edge of my applique fabric on the background. It's not catching the applique fabric, and then when it swings in, it's on the applique fabric. My goal is to keep my stitches that swing in and out perpendicular to the edge of my applique. So this stitch is doing 1 stitch straight, and that was off the edge of the applique right next to it. Then it swings in, swings out, 1 stitch and out. So on the straightaway, it's really easy to keep everything just so. But as I start coming into a curve, remember I want to keep that stitch perpendicular. So I'm going to slightly pivot. And if it's not perfectly perpendicular, it's not the end of the world. Any pivoting is going to happen while the needle is on the outside edge of the fabric. If you pivot while you're on the swing in and out, you're going to get a V on that stitch rather than a straight stitch. And my goal when I come into the corner is to put a stitch right there in that corner at 45 degrees. I don't always make it. Sometimes you're going to hold the fabric back just a little bit, or sometimes you're going to kind of scoot it forward to be able to do that. If you do enough of this, you'll be able to gauge fairly well. Pivot straight away. If this is the first time you're doing this, you're probably going to have to go fairly slow to keep the stitches where you want them to be. So here I'm holding it back to go into that corner. And it's not perfect, but and again I'm coming into another curve. So I like to put not only on outside corners, but if you have an inside corner, I like to pivot it so I get a stitch straight into an inside corner. I don't have one on this eye, so. And you can use a contrasting thread to stitch if you want it to really show, or you can use a matching thread. I used a matching on the black letters, which is a little bit hard to see, but you wouldn't have to do a blanket stitch on those. You could do a narrow zigzag with some invisible thread. If you're using invisible thread on black, make sure you get the smoke color. You want, if you're using invisible thread, you want the darker thread on all your darker thread fabrics. In fact, I use that one more than anything. And then the white or the clear monofilament or invisible thread, you're going to use on light colors like white or yellow, but most other colors you get a little bit of a shine so it shows more. Push it forward into that corner. And then when I come to the end, I can either just take my final stitch and then take my threads to the back, or I could use my tie-off feature on my machine. My letters are all sewn on with a machine blanket stitch. I do have some lessons learned after doing all of mine. If you're using black for your letters, you might want to consider the solid black batik because it's a higher thread count and a tighter weave, so it doesn't ravel quite as much. Another thing you might want to do is just put on a few letters at a time, like 3 or 4, stitch them down, and then add 3 or 4 more. I did consider putting my letters on the rows before I sewed it all together into a quilt, but some of them were going into the upper or the lower horizontal sashing, but you could leave those off and do them a row at a time because it is a lot of quilt to manipulate through your machine when you're doing the blanket stitch. But I'm okay with what I have, so mine is now ready to be quilted. That is the finished top if you add the letters.